As you probably know, our planet is at risk. There is an ecological crisis, and fortunately, there are people who are doing their best to change the tide of how that is going. But they themselves need care, need to be able to sustain themselves, to be able to do the work that they're doing. Welcome to Mindfulness Voyage. My name is Ted Meissner, and today we're going to be speaking about some of the ways in which mindfulness can help people who are working to save the planet sustain their actions. Our guest today is Karen Doyle Grossman. Karen, welcome to the podcast. Good to see you. Thanks for being here.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, Ted.
Well, I'm really eager to unpack what I've learned about with some of your recent work on your dissertation. But let's first, wondering if you could just tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, and what you do.
Sure. I started my career in international development and in community economic development in the US as well, and did that for about 15 years. But at the same time, around 2002, I found my teacher. Before that, I had this questioning coming up, and I know a lot of people experience this. I had met my at the time soon to be husband, and we were moving into a whole new phase of our lives, and everything seemed so wonderful. But I kept having this questioning. There must be something more. There must be something more. And with that questioning, I thought, my God, aren't you so ungrateful? You know, life is going really well. But I had this come up over and over as we were moving at the time from California to Minnesota. And then I arrived in Minneapolis, and I wanted to do, I've been doing yoga for a long time, and I wanted to do a yoga teacher training. So I found this book called the Wellness Tree, and I thought, could have been marketed better. It didn't have a very pretty cover, and I was like, I don't know. But my husband wanted me to call them because he said that the yoga teacher training it's much cheaper than all these others you're looking at. So I was like, oh, all right, all right, all right. Well, I call up the Institute of the Himalayan Tradition, and Justin O'Brien, my teacher, who is also known as Swamiji Bharati, he answered the phone with, "Well, I've been waiting for you." And, of course, I was taken aback, but I studied there. I ended up studying with him until he passed in 2021, and another teacher named Teresa King, both amazing, amazing teachers. And I so when I was doing that international development work, especially, which was I was looking a lot at conflict affected areas and fragile states. At the same time, I was getting deeper into this meditation tradition and doing annual silent retreats and benefiting so much. And I really needed to take a shift, from being a part of the international development field. I found that I needed to kind of look more at individual transformation than these large scale initiatives I was working on. So at about 2012, I made a big shift in my career to focus on how I could integrate contemplative sciences into organizational life. At the time, I started a job at the Kripalu Center for Yoga and have had the benefit of working for several organizations that are attempting just that, to integrate mindfulness and our lives at work. So this brought me all to the Berkshires in Massachusetts, where I live still the same guy, my husband, and and then we have three children. And I want to just mention that my oldest child, whose name is Colin, has autism, and he has been the most unbelievable teacher for me. Not even in a way of like, oh, it's hard. I mean, it was hard when he was younger, because he was an eloper, which means like sometimes it would be at 4 in the morning, he might leave the house and wander, and it was very stressful. but more than that, he is the best teacher. Like he is so joyful and so he doesn't really he lives kind of beyond time, and getting to witness someone who is living beyond time is an amazing experience. So I don't know if that's the kind of thing you wanted to know about, but that's just that helps to explain a little bit of why I'm doing the work that I'm doing now.
Wonderful. Thank you for that overview. And didn't know you're in Minnesota. We used to live in Eden Prairie before we moved out
You're
here.
in Plymouth. Oh,
Yep.
yeah.
Yep, exactly. So, what brought us here today is you recently successfully defended your doctoral thesis, and I'm wondering if you'd tell us a little bit about what that's about, and then we'll dive into the details.
Yeah, so the doctoral program took me 10 years, and I saw many, many people graduate in front of me. But I was raising three children and I had jobs, and um, so they were incredibly supportive. This was at Teachers College at Columbia University. And the dissertation is called The Role of Mindfulness in Warding Off Despair and Sustaining Ecological Action in the Context of Existential Threat. So kind of a mouthful. But it's really about how is it that the people, environmental professionals who are immersed in the day-to-day reality of our ecological crisis, how are they doing it? How do they keep going? That's what I really wondered, because I, who was not in the environmental field, was just overwhelmed at one point with grief because of what we're doing to nature. And I thought, how absurd. How could we possibly how could we unknowingly or knowingly destroy our only home? And it was really, really hard for me to take in. So I thought, well, there are people who are in this every single day and they're figuring it out. So, and in particular, I wanted to focus on people who had a mindfulness practice, because I had an inkling that, having a deep meditation practice myself, I thought they may be able to navigate some of the more difficult parts of the context, which turned out to be true. And so the idea was I had 19 individual case studies, basically, of people, 16 of whom have a tremendous amount of experience in some aspect of the environmental field, and three of whom were novices, so had fewer than 5 years. But everyone had a mindfulness practice of some sort, and those 16 longtime professionals had a very regular mindfulness practice. And I asked them all sorts of questions about how do they view the context? What are the hindrances to their learning to sustain themselves and their work at this time? And how do they apply their mindfulness practices to their ecological action? And it was completely fascinating what they said. It was so much richer than what I thought I was going to get, and I had high expectations. But I mean, honestly, their words were like poetry often. They were really inspiring.
So, what are some of the things that
Yeah.
were the gems of information? Were there some common themes that you found? And I'm curious if there are differences between those who were long-term practitioners and those who are relatively novice
Mm.
in the field. What was that like? What were some of the rich things that you found?
Yes. So, first of all, I think, and I'll back up at some point and talk a little bit about the what it means to operate in the context of existential threat. So, I was particularly looking at something called terror management theory and how that impacts uh, any human being, not just those who are immersed in the context. But what I found from these longtime professionals is that they were not escaping from the challenges at all. As one person said, my mindfulness practice enables me to look the monster in the face. And every day I can look that monster in the face. I don't, and I am going to contribute everything I can, basically. And there, so they were very nuanced and sophisticated, I'd say, in the way that they were applying their mindfulness practices. Um, Many were able to, they would say things like, I'm able to not react. I'm able to surface joy. I'm able to, um, I'm able to use my intuition, my imagination. So there were all sorts of ways that they used their mindfulness practices, but they really fell into three overarching buckets. One, I would say, I call it learning to endure. So many were operating in an existing system, and or they were working with people from the fossil fuel industry and people who, they were trying to persuade to behave differently. And they talked about, this is persevering in an existing system where they really have to hold on to their original assumptions. The second, I'd say it's not even a phase because I don't think it's linear. I think it's quite cyclical, would be learning to join with or learning to merge with. So think of this as an untethering from your original assumptions about a situation and allowing yourself to almost be suspended. So I think for people who practice mindfulness, this might seem familiar, that we're able to allow ourselves to be in a space of ambiguity and a space of not knowing. I think that this was something that was very, very important to the professional's ability to keep going, that they could sort of merge with the circumstances of the reality, how very, very difficult it is to look at what human beings are doing. As one person said, who has access to a lot of satellite data, watching, for example, deforestation, saying it's so much worse than people think, and it's so much worse than most people know, but still able to be with that reality and not act destructively. So what is happening often, I think, for most of us when we try to manage this terror unconsciously is we try to do things that bolster our self-esteem or to bolster our cultural worldview. And we see, like in political polarization that's happening all over the world, or we see this sort of in-group, out-group dynamics are becoming reinforced, that being in that place of suspending our assumptions is a really uncomfortable one for most people. But the professionals who are able to use their mindfulness practices to kind of stay in that space, it was a really, really important part of their journey. And then the last one was learning to transcend. And this was, think of this as like the pot of gold, at the end of the rainbow, where still being fully engaged in the difficult context of how are we going to address our ecological crisis and the poly crisis, but able also to transcend to a different level of reality. So whether that was through awe and wonder and, appreciating beauty, a lot was around reciprocal relationship with nature, which was a very particular practice that had importance. So I just wanted, those learning to endure, to merge with, and then transcend was it was really the major finding, I think, from my study, was seeing how people kind of moved in and out of those stages or those cycles in order to keep going and to also I'd say to express the best of humanity rather than acting out of fear and othering.
There's so much here. Thank you for that overview,
Mhm.
first off. And it's so interesting to hear you talk about these kinds of capabilities that mindfulness helped the people in your work with around dealing with ambiguity and uncertainty,
Mhm.
dealing in the face of crisis, and still maintain some balance and ability to stick with it. For those who have a contemplative practice, these may be very familiar themes. And so interesting to see this consistency across many different kinds of research, that these are some of the competencies and capabilities that people have and can be grown in their practice. And it applies in our everyday lives. It applies in very real world challenges like what we have going on right now. So one of the other things I'm curious about with this, Karen, is having done these have these conversations with people who are in the thick of it, have their practice, are coping in the face of great difficulties, shall we say. What are some things that either have been sparked in your mind or perhaps some of the sharings from those in your study about what some helpful next steps might be
Mm.
from this learning? What are ways in which we can make this a tangible thing in the world?
Yes. So, well, just to preface, so my study was quite exploratory. So there was no randomized control trial. There's no causality, right? So, but there were lots, as one of my readers of my in my defense said, there are many, many breadcrumbs that are pretty interesting for us to pursue. And one of those, I was speaking to a group, especially of people who were in the international development field and are undergoing the Doge terror reign over USAID right now, and they were a number of them were quite traumatized. I thought, okay, so they're in this learning to endure. They're not able to think about anything else. They're just trying to figure out how to survive and how to process what's happening to them. Um, but even just being able to name that that's a particular phase that's really important to honor. And then this idea that what would be their next step be? Is it because this is why the terror management theory backdrop is so important, is because, and I know this from working in conflict zones, after a war, you have the victim and the oppressor generally, and not always clean cut, but let's just, for purposes of simplicity, you have that. And I would always hear, the victor who had been oppressed is ready to become the oppressor. And that cycle happens again and again and again. So how do we stop that cycle? And that idea of being able to untether from what held one in place and be able to, before you know what will soon hold you in place, being able to be in that stage of merging with or joining with, I think is something that we need to figure out how to teach. How do we teach that in a way where many, many, many more people get comfortable with upheaval and uncertainty, but without having to lash out? So what I mean is, it's interesting to see that when we're confronting our own potential demise, one of the con unconscious or subconscious things that we do is we try to live on symbolically. Like we could have symbolic immortality, even if we are going to end ourselves. So clinging on to one's cultural worldview and making sure that one's cultural legacy will continue means derogating or extinguishing others so that yours can live on. And a lot of this is happening, below the conscious level, but we really, really need people to understand that that is so destructive. And it doesn't make a lot of sense because we're all going to die. And wouldn't we rather have the planet and life conducive, conditions continue on rather than our narrow cultural worldview that is going to evaporate like, in an instant. So I would love for us to understand that when we're working in adult education, which is the field that I'm in, or even in is we're teaching children, how do we help people to question and be open to reflection, but not try to indoctrinate people into a particular worldview? And how can we question our own tendency to want to do that to our kids, for example, or to friends? And yeah, so anyway, I could go on and on about this, but I think that's one thing that I think is really important. And I also think another finding that came up was having a reciprocal relationship with nature was 100% of the people who were practicing that as an intentional mindfulness practice also were engaged in the learning to transcend capacity. And so being able to step out of one's anthropocentric view and, especially now, step a little bit out of the modern human framework and understand what's happening in nature and have a relationship with other beings is incredibly powerful and soothing. So I think those are two things I would want to focus on.
And those are pretty interesting ones because they're about connectivity as such an important aspect to being able to continue on in the face of various adversities that we might have. So wrapping up, just one more question for you is for those who may be watching this, whether they are working in right now ecological crisis areas or that kind of work or other difficulties that are faced by the world right now, just based on your work, your background, your place as a human being, what are some things that you might share with people to perhaps encourage them that, yes, it's rough and you got this?
Yeah, I do think the idea of warding off despair was one that came up quite a bit for me as I was working on this over 4 years. I started during the pandemic, and I was, spending a lot of the pandemic reading about the data on our ecological crisis. It was incredibly depressing. And so I had to work hard to make sure that I was able to sustain my own work. And, there are a few things, of course, community came up, very, very important. Sorry. Community was whether it was a sangha, a community of practice, very important for people to learn their mindfulness practice and to sustain it. So having some sort of access to a lineage or to a teacher was pretty essential for most people. There was one person who was an autodidact. That's how he described himself, self-taught, and he was trying a lot of different mindfulness practices. But he was also, it was taking him longer actually to kind of move through the learning to endure, merge with, transcend cycles. I would highly recommend, based on my data, that as much as possible, find a teacher, find a community, or find even a lineage that you're reading about. I just talked to a friend of mine who was deciding between staying with her current teacher who was asking her to basically, go to a deeper level of commitment, or to move to something more flexible. It was going to be online. She was going to have an easier time, managing other responsibilities. And I said, and she really adores her teacher. She thinks that he's very ethical and very, very knowledgeable. And I said to her, it is so rare these days to be able to find a teacher. And if you find one, then um, then I would recommend trying to commit, and trying to go deeper as opposed to flitting around and trying all these different sorts of practices and allowing the kind of impulsive brain to just have a carnival. I think it's much harder, but to be one pointed and for example, trying the same method of meditation over years and years and years and going deeper is a totally different experience than going from tradition to tradition. And the openness is important. I'm not saying, but it's different than skating on the surface. So one, I would pursue depth. I think that is something that's just missing in our society. We are so incredibly great at innovation and technology and of course capitalism and now globalism, and we're not really good at finding depth from the perspective of inner development, and there's a lot of untapped potential there. So that would be one of my main messages. And it is hard to find a teacher, but it isn't as hard to find a community. And so through finding a community, I think people can find teachers. That would be one thing. And then I mentioned nature quite a bit, because I was really surprised at how powerful that, not just being in nature or walking alongside nature, it's truly being willing to have a relationship with nature as Sometimes it's your mother, sometimes it's your brother, sometimes it's your friend, sometimes it's your teacher or even, scary teacher. But having that full relationship with nature is something that's, I think, incredibly empowering these days when we've lost the plot a little bit on what does it mean to be human, fully human. And she's waiting. She's waiting there for us to listen. So yeah, those are a couple things I would say. There's so much more, but let me stop there.
Thank you for all of that. And as people who've been listening to this podcast and others for a while know that I fully agree with this idea of finding connection with a teacher, with a community. That support is helpful. And it's not that you can't go on your own, but as you were just sharing, Karen, that an individual who was doing it may be having a harder time. It's
Mhm.
okay. It may be the harder time is the right path for them, but it can always be helpful to be able to have a sounding board and that support of others.
Mhm.
Yeah. Well, our guest today, Karen Doyle Grossman, thank you for being here. And we're going to have links where links are found in this podcast. Thank you so much, Karen, for joining us.
Oh, thank you so much. This was a pleasure.
Thanks for tuning in today. I'm so glad that you could be here and hope you got something out of our discussion. Remember to like and subscribe to this podcast. It helps other people to find it as well. Remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can, and I'll see you next time on Mindfulness Voyage.